Satan, as a fallen being, does not have the ability to create. His power is entirely derivative, stemming from the misuse of what has been made. In the beginning, only God had the authority to create out of nothing. This divine act of creation is exclusive to the Creator, and even the most powerful of fallen angels, such as Satan, cannot mirror this ability. Satan's influence on the world is not one of creative power, but rather one of destruction and distortion. He cannot create new life, a new thought, or a new idea. He can only manipulate, corrupt, or pervert what already exists. When we look at the state of the world and the suffering that often fills it, it is easy to mistake this for the product of Satan's creation. Yet all suffering and evil are distortions of what was originally good. The suffering Satan inflicts is a perversion of what once was whole, and the evil he encourages is an abuse of free will. These actions do not represent true creation, but rather a desecration of it. The power of Satan is not in the ability to invent new things or bring forth life from nothing. Instead, his power lies in his capacity to twist what already exists, ideas, desires, and natural inclinations, into something harmful. The serpent in the garden did not create the fruit, nor did he make Eve's longing for knowledge. Instead, he manipulated and distorted these desires, leading humanity into disobedience. Satan's true danger lies in his ability to corrupt what was originally good, turning creation against itself. Even though Satan cannot create, he can create the illusion of creation. He plants thoughts, ideas, and desires that appear original or even righteous, but are ultimately based on deceit. His power lies in his ability to suggest, to deceive, and to convince us that our thoughts or desires are our own when, in fact, they are shaped by his manipulation. Satan's inability to create reminds us of the radical difference between creation and corruption. To create is to bring something new into existence that reflects goodness and truth. To corrupt is to take something that exists and twist it, leading it away from its intended purpose. Satan, through his pride, seeks to turn everything back on itself, to draw everything into chaos and disorder. He cannot create new beauty, but he can distort the beauty that already exists. As we consider this, we are reminded of the source of all creation, the Creator who brings forth life and order from the depths of nothingness. Every act of genuine creation, from the simplest act of kindness to the most magnificent piece of art, reflects the divine spark that originates with God alone. Satan may try to thwart or sabotage these acts, but he cannot replace them with anything that carries the same weight of truth and goodness. In our own lives, when we look at the challenges we face, it is easy to feel overwhelmed by the sense of destruction and decay. Yet we must always remember that Satan cannot create. He can only work with what already exists. This means that even in our brokenness, there is the potential for restoration. Though the enemy may try to twist and distort our lives, there is still hope because we are not beyond redemption. The Creator, who alone has the power to restore and renew, stands above Satan's destructive. Satan cannot create because his nature and essence are rooted in destruction and perversion, not in the act of bringing new things into existence. To understand the true scope of this inability, one must first recognize the difference between creation and manipulation. Creation is a sacred act, one that brings into being something that is good and true. It is a reflection of divine will and purpose, a manifestation of the Creator's love and wisdom. When God creates, he does so with a clear intention, imbued with a deeper meaning that resonates throughout the fabric of the universe. Creation, in its most profound sense, is not merely about the existence of things, but about giving life to order, beauty, and truth. Satan, in his fallen state, is cut off from this divine source of creation. His ability to influence the world comes not from any inherent creativity or power to give life, but rather from his ability to exploit and twist the things that have already been created. He operates within the confines of what exists, never able to truly give birth to anything new or truly good. His power lies in his ability to deceive, to make things appear as though they are of divine origin, when in fact they are warped, twisted versions of what was originally good. This inability to create is at the core of Satan's role as the adversary. He does not build or establish. He tears down and subverts. His work is one of destruction, of undermining the good and turning it into something harmful. The world we live in, full of suffering, pain, and confusion, is not the result of Satan's creative efforts, but of his distortions and manipulations of God's creation. Satan cannot make the world a better place by creating something new. Instead, he seeks to invert and corrupt what has already been made. Consider how he operates in the hearts of humanity. Satan cannot create love, for love is an expression of divine will. He cannot create hope, because hope is rooted in faith in the Creator. But Satan can sow seeds of doubt, jealousy, and despair. He can twist our natural desires for goodness and beauty, perverting them into selfishness, greed, and destruction. He takes what was meant for good, our desire for relationship, for belonging, for purpose, and turns it into an instrument of division and hatred. But even in this, he cannot create. He can only manipulate what has already been put in place by the Creator. This manipulation often works through our own desires and perceptions. Satan does not need to create new temptations. He simply manipulates what is already there. For instance, the desire for knowledge, which in itself is a gift, can be twisted into pride and arrogance. The longing for intimacy can be perverted into lust or exploitation. Even our basic need for security can become the root of fear and anxiety when Satan distorts it, making us place our trust in false idols rather than in the Creator who provides for us. It is precisely because Satan cannot create that his power is limited. He can deceive us, he can mislead us, and he can corrupt our minds and hearts. But he cannot make something from nothing. Every action of Satan is a reflection of this fundamental limitation. He does not have the power to build, only to destroy. He does not have the ability to bring forth new life, only to wither and decay what already exists. This is a crucial point to remember when we face the difficulties and temptations of life. While Satan may appear powerful, his strength lies only in his ability to manipulate what God has already created. He cannot create new suffering or new evil. He can only distort what has been given to us. For this reason, the Christian hope rests in the fact that creation, in all its goodness and beauty, is ultimately held in the hands of the Creator. Though Satan works tirelessly to undermine and distort God's creation, he cannot reverse the divine work of creation. Even in the face of evil, there is the promise of restoration, because the Creator alone is the true author of life. Satan may try to corrupt, but he cannot replace the life that comes from the Creator, and he cannot create anything that has the same power or beauty as what was first made by God. Therefore, we are called to remember that Satan's power is an illusion. It is a power built on lies and deceit, not on any true creative force. His actions are fleeting, temporary, and ultimately futile because they are based on a fundamental inability to create something of lasting value. In contrast, the Creator continues to sustain all things, bringing forth life and renewal in a way that Satan cannot even begin to measure. While the adversary may attempt to disrupt and destroy, he is always working with something that already exists, never able to generate something new, good or true. Satan's inability to create extends far beyond the mere act of bringing things into existence. It speaks to a deeper, more profound limitation, the fact that his influence operates solely within the realm of corruption. The act of creation in its purest sense involves the capacity to bring order, structure, and meaning to the chaos of nothingness, an act that is inherently divine. Creation, whether it is the universe or the smallest act of kindness, reflects the eternal, unchanging nature of the Creator. The Creator who brings forth life gives it purpose and meaning. Satan, however, in his rebellion, can do nothing but twist and distort what is already there. He can influence, he can corrupt, he can deceive, but he can never create. This inability to create shows us the stark contrast between the power of God and the so-called power of Satan. In the beginning, the Creator fashioned the world out of nothing. He spoke, and the universe came into being. God's creative act was not only an act of power, but one of love. Every part of creation, from the vastness of the cosmos to the smallest living organism, was made with purpose, and each part reflected the goodness of its Creator. Every creation was a gift, a moment of divine intention made manifest in the material world. But Satan cannot do this. He cannot speak life into being. He cannot mold the world according to his desires. He is restricted to manipulating the created order for his own ends, always working with the raw material that has already been made. In this sense, Satan's power is less than creative, it is inherently parasitic. When we understand Satan's role as one who can only manipulate and pervert, it becomes clear how his influence spreads. Satan does not need to build new systems of evil. He simply takes the good things that already exist, things like love, beauty, truth, and desire, and corrupts them. The temptation he offers does not come as something entirely new, but as a distortion of something already present. For instance, the desire for knowledge, which in its rightful place leads to understanding and wisdom, can easily become a desire for power and control. The natural inclination to care for others, which is rooted in love, can be distorted into possessiveness, greed, and manipulation. The longing for beauty can turn into vanity, obsession, or idolatry. Satan does not introduce new ideas, but instead twists the ideas that already exist, contorting them into something unrecognizable. It is in this distortion that Satan's most powerful influence is revealed. His ability to corrupt is rooted in the very nature of temptation. He does not create new desires, but awakens desires that already exist within us and redirects them toward destruction. His influence begins with a whisper, a suggestion that something good could be better if we change it, if we take it in a direction that was never intended. Satan's greatest strength lies in his subtlety, in his ability to make us believe that what we want is good and right, even when it is a perversion of what was originally intended. He cannot create the desires within us. He can only shape them, bend them toward his own evil purposes. This is also why Satan's work is often invisible, difficult to pinpoint. He does not build an empire of evil from scratch. Instead, he takes what already exists and twists it until it becomes a force of destruction. The world we live in, full of confusion and suffering, is not the result of Satan's creation, but of his distortion of creation. Each instance of hatred, greed, and cruelty in the world is not a product of Satan's act of creation, but a product of his efforts to corrupt what was once good. The more we look at the world and the evil within it, the more we realize that Satan's influence works not by building something new, but by disassembling what has already been made. Despite this, there is a tremendous source of hope in understanding Satan's limitation. His inability to create means that his power is inherently finite. While Satan can cause immense suffering by twisting what is good, he cannot create suffering from nothing. He cannot create new realities. He can only pervert those that already exist. This is why every act of true creation, every act of goodness, beauty, and truth stands in stark contrast to the work of Satan. Though Satan may seek to destroy, to cause chaos, and to corrupt the world, the power of creation still resides in the hands of the Creator alone. This gives us hope, because even when the world seems overrun with the fruits of corruption, we know that these things are not the result of true creation. They are merely distortions, temporary aberrations that cannot stand against the power of the Creator. As we navigate our lives and face the trials that come from living in a broken world, we must always remember that Satan cannot create. His power, such as it is, operates only within the confines of the original creation. Though he may distort our desires, he cannot make us into something we are not. He cannot create new forms of evil, only corrupt the ones already present. In this we find both a warning and a comfort. The warning is that we must remain vigilant, guarding our hearts and minds against the distortions of the evil one. But the comfort is that, ultimately, Satan's ability to affect the world is limited by his own inability to create anything truly new. The Creator is still the true author of all that is good, and no matter how Satan may twist and manipulate, the goodness of creation cannot be undone. Satan's inability to create goes far beyond a simple lack of power to manifest life or bring new things into existence. It is at its core a reflection of his entire nature, one that is rooted in selfishness, pride, and rebellion against the Creator. His fall was not merely the loss of power, but the rejection of the divine order and purpose that gives true creation its meaning. Satan's inability to create highlights the difference between divine creation and the counterfeit that he perpetuates. True creation is an act of love, a gift from God that reflects his goodness, beauty, and purpose. In contrast, Satan's attempts to manipulate and destroy reflect his rejection of these very qualities. In the act of creation, God brings something into existence that has inherent value and meaning. Every tree, every star, every human life is a reflection of God's perfect intention. Creation is an expression of His will made in love, and each element of creation exists to fulfill a particular purpose. God's creation is a reflection of His nature, ordered, purposeful, good and true. But Satan, in his rebellion, cannot participate in this divine act. He does not possess the ability to create anything with inherent goodness or purpose. His actions are solely focused on undermining and corrupting the work of the Creator. He cannot create beauty, only twist what is beautiful. He cannot create truth, only distort it. His actions are not acts of creative power, but acts of parasitic destruction. Consider the way in which Satan works in the hearts and minds of people. He cannot create new desires, but he can exploit the desires that already exist within us. Human beings have a deep and innate longing for meaning, for love, and for connection. These desires, rooted in the image of the Creator, are good and necessary for a flourishing life. But Satan, in his deceit, seeks to turn these desires into something that leads us away from God. He takes our natural desire for love and turns it into a selfish need for possession or control. He takes our longing for meaning and distorts it into the search for fame, power, or personal gratification. Satan takes what is good and twists it, making it seem as though what we truly need can be found outside of God's will. The reality of Satan's limitations is that, while he can corrupt, he can never truly create a new form of evil. He cannot give birth to new ways of suffering or new forms of oppression. Instead, he can only take the good things that already exist and pervert them. This is why sin in its essence is not something new. It is a corruption of something that was originally. The temptation to lie, for example, is not a new creation of evil. It is a distortion of the human ability to speak truth. The temptation to hate is not a new form of evil. It is a perversion of the human ability to love. Satan cannot create evil from nothing. Instead, he takes the good that exists and turns it on its head. This limitation reveals Satan's inherent weakness. His power is built on deceit and manipulation, not on true creation or invention. While he may appear powerful, it is important to remember that his influence is always secondary. He does not have the capacity to generate new independent sources of evil. His power is entirely dependent on distorting the good and beautiful things that God has already created. The very fact that Satan's influence is parasitic is a sign of his profound lack of true power. He cannot bring anything new into being, and every act of corruption he carries out is, in a sense, an act of desperation, a vain attempt to usurp the place of the Creator. This is why, in moments of darkness and suffering, it is essential for believers to remember that Satan's work is ultimately powerless in comparison to the Creator's will. God alone is the author of all that is good. While Satan may attempt to manipulate, corrupt, or distort creation, he cannot undo what has already been made. No matter how much suffering Satan may cause, it cannot erase the inherent goodness of God's original design. Satan's corruption is temporary, fleeting, and ultimately futile. The world may appear to be filled with destruction and pain, but these are the result of Satan's manipulations, not new creations. Every act of evil, every distortion of truth is a sign of his desperation and his impotence in the face of the Creator's power. Furthermore, the fact that Satan cannot create is a reminder to us of the importance of seeking the Creator in all things. When we encounter the brokenness and evil of the world, we are called to return to the source of all good. The Creator has given us the ability to create, not in the way that he does, but in the way that reflects his image. Through acts of love, kindness, and beauty, we can participate in the divine act of creation. These acts do not come from us alone, but are gifts given to us by God, who works through us to restore what has been broken. In this way, we can reclaim the power of true creation, resisting the manipulations of the enemy. While Satan can distort and pervert, he can never create new life or bring new beauty into being. His power is rooted in lies, deception, and destruction, and he can only work with what already exists. This means that even in the face of great evil, there is always the potential for redemption and restoration. The Creator has made the world good, and though it is marred by corruption, it remains fundamentally. Satan's inability to create is a powerful reminder that all true power comes from God, and that his creation, no matter how twisted or broken it may appear, will ultimately be restored by his hand. Even in the darkest moments, we can find hope, because we know that the work of the Creator is never undone. Satan's inability to create is not only a fundamental limitation, but also a deep reflection of his character and the nature of his rebellion. In considering his inability to create, we must recognize that Satan's fall from grace was not merely a loss of power, but a rejection of divine order and purpose. He sought to place himself on the same level as God, desiring to be worshipped as the Creator rather than as a created being. But in doing so, he forfeited his capacity to create, for true creation is an act of selflessness, of giving something into existence for a greater good, while Satan's rebellion was driven by a desire to take, to corrupt, and to destroy. True creation comes from a place of love, selflessness, and humility grounded in the will of God. It seeks to bring order out of chaos, light out of darkness, and life out of nothing. God, in his infinite wisdom and goodness, creates for the sake of his creatures, to share his glory and provide for their needs. Creation is not an act of selfishness, but an act of grace, a gift given freely by the Creator. Satan, in contrast, can do none of this. He cannot create because creation requires a heart that seeks to give, and Satan's heart is one of pride and selfishness. His desire is not to give but to take, not to build but to destroy. The very nature of his rebellion, his rejection of God's good order, means that he cannot participate in the act of creation. He cannot bring life or goodness into being. He can only manipulate what already exists, twisting it into something destructive. Consider the world we live in today. It is easy to point to the brokenness, the suffering, and the evil, and to think that these things must be the result of some creative force. It is easy to believe that the darkness of the world represents some kind of new creation, a new order brought forth by some malevolent power. But if we understand that Satan cannot create, we begin to see that the evil and suffering in the world are not new creations at all. They are distortions of what was originally good. Satan cannot create suffering from nothing. He can only exploit the goodness that God has already made, turning it against itself. The pain we experience is not a product of Satan's creative power. It is the result of his corrupting influence, twisting God's good creation into something that leads to suffering. Whether through human sin, natural disasters, or the corruption of the human heart, the brokenness we encounter is the fruit of Satan's manipulation, not his creation. The implications of this truth are profound. When we face difficulties, temptations, or the suffering that inevitably comes in life, we must remember that Satan's power is ultimately derivative and parasitic. He does not have the ability to create suffering or evil out of nothing. His work is not the work of creation, but of corruption, and that is why, in the end, it is always limited. He can only work with what has already been made. This means that the darkness and evil in the world are not invincible forces, but are temporary perversions of something that was once good. Even in the deepest despair, we can find hope in knowing that Satan cannot create anything new, including new forms of evil. His influence, while powerful, is ultimately finite because it is based on distortion, not creation. Moreover, Satan's inability to create speaks to the futility of his rebellion. Satan's very act of attempting to usurp God's place, of desiring to create apart from the Creator, is an inherently futile. To try and create outside of God's will is to try and bring forth life from death, to try and make something good out of that which is already corrupted. No matter how much Satan tries to manipulate or deceive, he cannot escape the fact that all life, all creation, originates with God. This is why Satan's work, though it may seem overwhelming at times, is ultimately doomed to failure. No matter how much he distorts the truth, no matter how much he twists the good things of creation, he can never create anything lasting or real. His work is always temporary, always dependent on God's original creation, always working within the limits of what has already been made. This truth also teaches us about the nature of evil. Evil, in its essence, is not something that is created. It is the absence or perversion of good. Evil is not a force in itself, but a distortion of the good that God created. As such, evil is not a power that can stand on its own. It is always parasitic, feeding off the goodness of creation. This is why Satan's influence is limited. He cannot create evil from scratch. He can only distort the good things that already exist. He takes the goodness of human desires, such as the desire for love, for meaning, for security, and turns them into something that leads us away from God. But even in this distortion, Satan is not creating anything new. He is only twisting what has already been given to us by the Creator. It is because Satan cannot create that we can have confidence in the ultimate triumph of good over evil. Since Satan can only pervert what has already been made, the ultimate victory is not about creating something new, but about restoring what has been corrupted. The Creator has promised to make all things new, to restore the world to its original goodness and purpose. The restoration of creation is not a creative act in the sense of making something from nothing, but a restorative act, returning creation to its original form, undoing the distortions of sin and evil. This is why the ultimate hope of the Christian faith is not in the creation of something new, but in the renewal of what has already been made, in the restoration of creation to its intended purpose. While Satan may twist, distort, and corrupt, he cannot create. His power is based on lies and deception, not on the ability to bring something new into existence. This is why in the end his work will be undone. His influence, while pervasive, is ultimately doomed to failure because it is based on corruption, not creation. The Creator alone is the source of all life, and the Creator alone has the power to restore and redeem. Even in the midst of suffering, we can trust that God is at work, bringing about His purposes in the world, renewing what has been broken and restoring what has been lost. The Creator is greater than the one who seeks to destroy, and the hope of redemption is found in the fact that God's work of creation, restoration, and renewal will ultimately prevail. Satan's inability to create is a profound theological truth that has far-reaching implications for how we understand the nature of evil, the nature of God, and the ultimate victory of good over evil. His inability to create exposes a fundamental weakness in his power. Unlike God, who creates from nothing and brings order, beauty, and life out of chaos, Satan's influence is limited to manipulation and distortion. This fact challenges many of the assumptions that we may have about the nature of the spiritual battle that surrounds us, and it offers profound hope to those who seek to understand the true nature of God's power and the ultimate triumph of His goodness. The nature of Satan's rebellion, when we consider it in light of his inability to create, reveals a deep truth about pride. Satan's desire to elevate himself to the status of creator, to rival God, is an act of profound arrogance. His rebellion was not merely about desiring power, it was about desiring a role that could never be his, a role that could only belong to God alone. To try to create apart from the Creator is a rejection of the divine order, an act of self-deception that is inherently self-destructive. Satan's pride led him to believe that he could somehow create in a way that rivaled the Creator's divine act of bringing something good into being. Yet, by attempting to create something from nothing, he set himself up for failure because his very nature was not capable of true creation. Satan's rebellion, therefore, is marked by the irony that in rejecting God's perfect creative act, he made himself powerless, trapped in a role that was inherently limited and ultimately futile. This understanding of Satan's nature also sheds light on the insidious way in which he operates in the world. Since Satan cannot create anything, his power is exercised by exploiting the existing creation for his own purposes. He is a corrupter, not a creator. This is why his influence is so pervasive and often difficult to detect. He operates in the shadows, twisting good desires and divine intentions to serve his own dark end. The desires that God has implanted in human beings, the desire for love, for beauty, for justice, for meaning, are all good in their original form. But Satan does not create new desires. Instead, he perverts them. He takes these good desires and turns them into selfish cravings. Love becomes possessiveness, beauty becomes vanity, justice becomes revenge. Satan is not creating something new. He is simply distorting what already exists, taking it and using it for purposes that are contrary to the divine will. The reality that Satan cannot create also serves as a profound reminder of the true nature of evil. Evil, at its core, is not a force in itself. It is not a creative power, a force that exists on its own. Evil is the absence or corruption of good. When we encounter evil, we are not witnessing a creative force at work, but a distortion of the good that already exists. This is why, throughout the history of humanity, we see that evil is often subtle and difficult to pinpoint. It does not rise out of nothing, but comes from the twisting of something that was originally good. It is not a new creation, but a perversion, an imitation of the goodness of creation, distorted into something harmful. This understanding of evil as a corruption rather than a creation gives us important perspective when we face the challenges and temptations of life. In our struggles against sin, against temptation, we may often feel as though evil is an overwhelming force, something that has an independent power over us. But when we recognize that Satan's influence is dependent on his ability to twist and distort, we understand that evil is ultimately powerless in the face of God's creation. Evil cannot stand on its own. It only exists as a corruption of the good things that God has made. It is an insidious force, always seeking to distort what is true, good, and beautiful, but it cannot create anything that is true or good in itself. When we recognize this, we can begin to approach the struggles of life with a greater sense of hope, knowing that evil is not a force in itself, but a distortion of what has already been made. It is ultimately dependent on the good, and therefore its power is limited. One of the most important implications of Satan's inability to create is that it sheds light on the ultimate victory of God over evil. As we look around the world, we often see the effects of Satan's manipulations, suffering, hatred, division, and despair. But if we remember that Satan cannot create, we realize that these manifestations of evil are not independent forces that are beyond God's reach. They are distortions of what has been made good by God. God's work is an act of creation, bringing order out of chaos and light into darkness. But God's work is also restorative. Even in the midst of corruption, the Creator has the power to redeem and restore what has been broken. Satan cannot create evil, he can only distort. And because of this, God's power to heal, to restore, and to renew is always greater than Satan's power to destroy. This is the great hope of the Christian faith, that the Creator is at work restoring all things to their original goodness. Satan may continue his work of distortion and manipulation, but it is God who holds the power of true creation, and it is God who will ultimately bring all things back into alignment with his divine will. The final victory will not be about creating something new, but about restoring the original creation to its intended purpose. This restoration will undo the effects of sin and evil, and it will bring about a new creation, one where the distortion of the world's beauty, truth, and goodness is no more. This is why the Christian hope is not a hope in a new creation, but in the renewal of all things, a return to the goodness and beauty of God's original creation, made perfect in Christ. Finally, Satan's inability to create calls us to a deeper trust in the Creator. In moments of trial, when we face the chaos and suffering of the world, we can take comfort in knowing that God is the true Creator and that his creative power is unassailable. No matter how much Satan seeks to distort, God's creation remains unbroken at its core. The Creator is always at work, renewing, restoring, and bringing forth life. While Satan's work is marked by manipulation and destruction, God's work is one of life, of love, and of beauty. And because of this, we can have confidence in the ultimate victory of good over evil, knowing that Satan, in all his attempts to corrupt and destroy, will never have the power to create something that can stand against the will of God. Satan's inability to create, when considered in its fullest sense, speaks not only to his limitations, but also to the broader framework of the spiritual battle that plays out in the world. The fundamental nature of this battle is defined by the stark contrast between God as the creator and Satan as the corrupter. Understanding that Satan cannot create but can only distort brings clarity to the nature of evil and sin in our world. It also helps us comprehend why God's victory is so certain and why evil, despite its seeming omnipresence and power, can never truly overcome the inherent goodness of the divine order. The question of creation goes to the heart of the nature of being itself. Creation is an act that brings something into existence, making it real and giving it substance. It is an act that originates in God, who creates ex nihilo, from nothing. This is the divine prerogative, something that only God can do. In bringing things into being, God also imbues them with purpose, meaning, and value. Every created thing, whether it be a blade of grass or a human soul, is a reflection of God's will and intention. But Satan, in his rebellion, cannot do this. He cannot speak things into existence. He cannot breathe life into the lifeless. His power, as potent as it may seem, is always derivative, never original. Every evil temptation, every falsehood he spreads is not the birth of a new creation, but the manipulation of existing creation. This inability of Satan to create speaks to a deeper truth about the nature of the world we live in. When we look at the evil that exists in the world, whether in the form of personal sin, systemic injustice, or widespread suffering, it is easy to assume that this is something that has been created. We might think that Satan has conjured this evil from his own imagination, that he has created suffering and darkness out of nothing. But this is not the case. The evil we witness is always the result of a perversion of God's good creation. Sin itself is a distortion of what God intended for humanity. For example, hatred is not a creation of evil, but the perversion of love. Pride is not a new creation, but the distortion of humility. Even death, the greatest weapon Satan has, is not a creation of evil. It is a consequence of the fall, a perversion of life itself. Satan, therefore, does not introduce something new into the world. He simply twists what was originally created to be good. In this sense, the nature of evil itself is exposed as parasitic. Evil feeds off the good. It is dependent on the existence of what is good in order to distort and corrupt it. Satan cannot create evil from scratch, because evil has no existence independent of good. The very reason why evil is so powerful and pervasive in the world is that it has a foothold in something that is good, the desires and inclinations that God has planted within human being. The temptation that Satan uses to corrupt us is not an entirely new creation, but a distortion of something good and natural. Our desire for food can become gluttony. Our desire for love can become lust. Our desire for success can become idolatry. Satan doesn't create these desires. He redirects them, bends them out of shape, making them destructive rather than life-giving. This parasitic nature of evil highlights a profound reality. Satan's power is always at its core. While he may seem powerful in the world, the truth is that he is always dependent on what God has created. He cannot bring anything new into being, nor can he create anything good. His power is essentially derivative, drawn from the goodness of the created world, and that is why it is limited. Satan cannot create new forms of evil because they do not exist outside of the corruption of good. This is a powerful truth for the believer to hold on to in times of trial. When we face temptation, suffering, or evil in the world, we must remember that these things are not new creations of Satan. They are distortions of the good. This should remind us that, while evil may feel overwhelming, it is ultimately a borrowed power, a power that is reliant on what God has made. In this sense, Satan's power is not as great as it may appear. God's ability to create, in contrast, is boundless. God does not merely manipulate what is already there. He brings something new into being, something that reflects his glory and good. The beauty and grandeur of creation, from the smallest atom to the vast expanse of the universe, all reflect the creativity of God. It is through his creation that God continually reveals his character and his will. Satan, however, can only mimic. He can never create something entirely new, nor can he fashion something that truly reflects divine goodness. His actions are always reactions to God's work, never originating from a wellspring of true creativity. Even the greatest evils Satan may attempt to bring into the world are distortions of something that has already been made by God. This brings us to a key aspect of the ultimate victory of good over evil. While Satan may exert influence through corruption, the foundational reality of the created world is that it is good. The goodness of creation is inherent in its very nature, and that goodness will ultimately prevail. The power of creation lies not in the evil that seeks to distort it, but in the fact that creation itself was brought into existence by the Creator and is thus inherently good. Despite all the ways that Satan may twist and corrupt God's good world, the power of the Creator will always outlast the power of the corrupter. This truth is woven through the entire narrative of Scripture, the story of creation, fall and redemption. The evil that Satan attempts to unleash in the world is not the final word. God's will expressed through the act of creation will ultimately restore and redeem all things. Understanding that Satan cannot create, and that evil is a perversion of the good, provides a framework for understanding the Christian hope. The hope of the believer is not in the defeat of a powerful evil that has the power to create new forms of suffering and oppression, but in the ultimate restoration of what has been broken. The new creation promised by God will not be the product of Satan's destruction, but of God's redeeming love. The fall of humanity into sin was a distortion of God's original creation. But the redemption of humanity through Christ will be a restoration, a return to the goodness of God's design. The world will not be remade in the image of Satan's corruption, but in the image of God's original creation, made new and perfect in Christ. In the end, Satan's inability to create is not just a statement about his limitations. It is a declaration of the power of God's creative will. The world that Satan seeks to corrupt, the desires that he seeks to distort, and the truth that he seeks to destroy are all ultimately dependent on God's original creation. Satan can never undo what God has made, because creation, in all its beauty and goodness, is sustained by the Creator's will. As we face the trials and tribulations of this world, we are called to remember that the ultimate victory does not belong to Satan, the corrupter, but to God, the Creator. The final victory will be the restoration of all things to their rightful place in God's plan, and no distortion of evil can prevent that from happening. This is the great hope for all believers, that Satan's power is not an independent creative force, but a transient distortion that will ultimately be undone by the power of God's restorative love. As we continue to reflect on Satan's inability to create, we must consider the deeper implications of this limitation in the context of spiritual warfare. This truth, the fact that Satan cannot create, invites us to shift our focus away from the false sense of power that evil often appears to possess. When we see the world through the lens of God's original design and the Creator's unshakable authority, we come to realize that the apparent strength of Satan is not grounded in his ability to generate anything new or good. His power is not the result of his own creative force, but is instead a counterfeit, a perversion of God's good intentions for the world. This insight not only challenges the way we view Satan's role in the world, but also helps us understand our own position within the larger narrative of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. To recognize that Satan cannot create means we must acknowledge that the evils and injustices we witness in the world are not a result of some independent force at work. Instead, the suffering, cruelty, and brokenness we experience are the result of Satan's manipulation of what was originally good. For example, consider the destructive forces that emerge from greed, envy, and pride, each of which distorts the good desires for prosperity, relationship, and self-worth. These desires, when perverted by Satan, lead to corruption, sin, and violence. But the key here is that the evil of greed, envy, and pride were never created by Satan. They were merely twisted versions of something God had designed for good. What Satan cannot do in his rebellion is to create a new form of evil from nothing. What he can do is introduce falsehood and temptation, distort human inclinations, and mislead people into choosing that which is ultimately harmful, both to themselves and to others. His goal is not to create, but to corrupt. He tries to turn the good gifts of God into chains that bind us, to prevent us from living in accordance with the true purpose that God has for us. But this can only be done through deception. Evil, as we've seen, cannot stand on its own. It is only through the distortion of the good that exists, and that is why it can never truly create a lasting reality. In the same vein, the limitations of Satan's power underscore an important truth about the nature of the conflict between good and evil. Though evil seems pervasive at times, it is never the original force. The temptation to succumb to despair in the face of evil is a real one, but it arises from a misunderstanding of the true nature of Satan's role. While Satan has influence and power to deceive, he cannot create evil ex nihilo, he can only corrupt the good. The power of evil is thus not a force independent of good, nor is it an equal counterpart to God's creative power. Rather, evil is a parasite relying on the existence of good to spread and distort. This distinction also serves to highlight the role of humanity in the cosmic drama between good and evil. We are not the creators of evil, Satan is, but we are also not passive victims in this struggle. While Satan seeks to deceive and manipulate, we are called to stand firm in the goodness of God's creation. It is only by aligning ourselves with God's purposes, by submitting our wills to the Creator, that we can resist the power of Satan's temptations and avoid falling into the traps he sets. The act of resisting evil is not about combating a power that is equal to God's. It is about resisting a lie, a distortion of the truth. And when we resist, we are not participating in a battle of creation versus creation, but rather in the resistance of a lie against the truth of God's goodness. This dynamic is made clear when we examine the way in which Christ's sacrifice on the cross fundamentally undermines the power of Satan. Through his death and resurrection, Christ did not simply defeat an equal adversary in the form of Satan. Instead, he exposed the impotence of Satan's power. By choosing death on the cross, Jesus was willing to endure the worst of what Satan could throw at him, the suffering, the hatred, the shame, the rejection, but he did so without yielding to it. Satan had no power over Christ's death because Christ was not subject to the corrupting influence of sin. Christ, in his purity, remained the Creator, even in the face of the worst distortion of creation, the fall of humanity through sin, and in his resurrection he restored what was broken and made it new again. Satan's inability to create, to bring forth something new, was revealed in the greatest moment of spiritual warfare, when Christ overcame death and sin, not through force, but through the power of self-giving love and sacrificial restoration. Furthermore, the truth that Satan cannot create offers believers an enduring hope. It shows us that evil is ultimately bound by the limits of creation. No matter how powerful Satan's influence may seem, it is always within the confines of the created world. Satan cannot create something that transcends God's design. He can only distort and corrupt what has already been made. This is why the hope of the Christian faith lies in the restoration of God's original purpose for creation. The redemption that Christ offers is not a matter of creating something new, but of restoring what has been lost. Through his sacrifice, Christ makes it possible for humanity to return to its original calling, to be in right relationship with God, to live in harmony with creation, and to be free from the distortions of sin that Satan perpetuates. In the final analysis, Satan's inability to create is a testament to his impotence. While he may continue to wield power in the world by manipulating human desires and distorting the good, he is always dependent on God's creation. He can never generate anything new. This reality calls us to recognize that in the end, Satan's work is futile. Every distortion he brings to the world is temporary, for God is at work to restore and redeem all that Satan has marred. The final victory, the ultimate triumph, does not belong to Satan. It belongs to God, the creator of all things, who will bring about a new heaven and a new earth, a restored creation where evil and death are no more, and where God's goodness and creativity will shine forth forever. This is the ultimate source of Christian hope, the promise that God will bring his creation to its intended fulfillment. Evil may persist for a time, but it is not an independent force. It is a distortion of the good, a perversion of the Creator's will. And because evil cannot create, it will never have the power to thwart God's plan. As Christians, we are called to stand firm in this truth, knowing that the Creator is greater than the corrupter, and that the redemption of all things is already secured in Christ. Our hope, then, is not in the defeat of a powerful and equal evil, but in the ultimate restoration of God's good creation. And in this hope, we find the strength to resist the temptations and deceptions of the enemy, knowing that his power is ultimately limited and his defeat assured. As we continue to reflect on Satan's inability to create and the broader theological significance of this truth, It is crucial to explore how this understanding deepens our comprehension of the nature of evil, spiritual warfare, and ultimately, our role as believers in the fight against the forces of darkness. The recognition that Satan is incapable of true creation offers us a profound insight into why evil can never be an equal force to the goodness of God. While Satan's influence is real, it is never an independent power, but rather a parasitic distortion that can never rival the creative act of God. This understanding should encourage believers to live confidently in the knowledge that the ultimate victory is God's, and Satan, though seemingly powerful, is ultimately bound by limitations. When we examine evil, it often seems as though it has a life of its own. We witness suffering, injustice, hatred, and sin all around us, and the temptation arises to view these as entities in themselves, forces of evil that are self-contained and capable of operating outside of God's sovereign will. However, when we recognize that Satan cannot create anything, we see that evil has no existence independent of the good. Evil is not a created thing that has emerged from nowhere. Rather, it is a twisted distortion of the good things that God has made. This recognition shifts the way we perceive the battle between good and evil. Evil does not stand alone, and it cannot create anything new. It is parasitic, feeding off the good that God created and distorting it into something harmful. Take, for instance, the issue of human suffering. It is easy to see suffering as a force in itself, something that exists as a dark and powerful entity. But suffering, while painful and tragic, is not a creation of Satan. Suffering came into the world as a result of sin, the result of humanity's decision to fall away from God and his plan. Satan did not create suffering. He simply perverted the goodness of creation, which was meant to be a place of peace, joy, and fulfillment. The entrance of sin into the world brought suffering along with it. Suffering is not a creation, but a consequence of the corruption of creation. When we understand this, we are better equipped to face suffering in our own lives. We do not face a force that is inherently powerful on its own. We face the consequences of Satan's distortion of God's good creation. And in facing that distortion, we are also called to participate in the work of redemption restoration, seeking to bring healing to a broken world. This truth about Satan's inability to create also profoundly impacts the way we view sin and temptation. Every time we are tempted, we are not being offered something entirely new or creative by Satan. Rather, Satan takes what is good and twists it, making it appear as if the distorted version he offers is more appealing, more desirable, or more satisfying than the original. Satan's power, therefore, lies not in his ability to create new desires or new opportunities, but in his ability to manipulate and twist what God has already made. God created humanity with desires for love, purpose, intimacy, and fulfillment. These desires, when aligned with God's will, are good and lead to abundant life. But Satan seeks to corrupt these desires, to offer counterfeit versions that promise fulfillment but ultimately lead to destruction. The temptation in the Garden of Eden is a prime example of this. Satan didn't create a new desire in Adam and Eve. He simply distorted their desire for knowledge and autonomy, making them think that they could achieve something apart from God's design. By understanding that Satan cannot create anything new, we are better able to recognize the false promises of sin and temptation. We can see that they are merely distortions of what is good, and we can resist the lie that they are anything other than a perversion of the Creator's plan. Furthermore, Satan's inability to create means that he cannot undo the creative work of God. While he can seek to distort and corrupt, he cannot unmake the good things that God has already created. When we look at the world, it is easy to be overwhelmed by the presence of evil and suffering. But when we understand that Satan's power is inherently limited, we can see that evil has no lasting substance. It is not a creative force but a destructive one, and because of this, it cannot create anything that can ultimately endure. Satan cannot create life, and he cannot create love, peace, or joy. He can only twist them. This should bring us great comfort, for it means that while evil may seem overwhelming in the moment, it is not the final word. God's goodness, his creation, his order, and his plan for redemption will ultimately prevail. Satan's distortions can never overpower the eternal truth of God's design. The creative power of God is unassailable, and as His people, we can take confidence in the ultimate victory of good over evil. This realization that Satan cannot create anything also has significant implications for our understanding of spiritual warfare. In the heat of the battle against sin, temptation, and the forces of darkness, it can sometimes feel as though Satan has the upper hand, as though evil is an insurmountable force that can never be overcome. But when we remember that Satan is only a corrupter, not a creator, we understand that he can never bring forth anything new or truly original. The only way he can act is by taking what has already been created by God and twisting it into something harmful. This is why the weapons of spiritual warfare, prayer, scripture, faith and righteousness are so powerful. They are grounded in the Creator's original design, and they cannot be corrupted by Satan. The Word of God, the truth of God's promises, the power of the Holy Spirit, these are all rooted in the eternal, unchanging goodness of God's creation. And because Satan can only distort and manipulate, he is ultimately powerless in the face of these divine truths. Additionally, the reality that Satan cannot create reminds us that the ultimate victory belongs to God, the Creator of all things. Satan may deceive, manipulate, and distort, but he cannot undo God's original plan for creation. The redemption that Christ accomplished through his death and resurrection was not merely a defeat of Satan in battle. It was the restoration of the world to its original purpose. Through Christ, God is bringing about a new creation, a restored world in which the distortions of sin and evil will be completely undone. The ultimate goal of God's plan is not to create something new in opposition to Satan's power, but to restore the good world that Satan sought to corrupt. In the new heaven and the new earth, there will be no more distortion, no more corruption, no more death or sin. All things will be made new, and all that was twisted will be set right. Finally, recognizing that Satan cannot create challenges us to reassess our understanding of power in the spiritual life. Power in the Christian faith is not about having the ability to create something new, to generate something from nothing. Power in the biblical sense is about participating in God's redemptive work in the world, working in alignment with His creative will to restore, heal, and redeem what has been broken. Power is not about defeating Satan through force or might, but about standing firm in the truth of God's creation and resisting the distortions that Satan seeks to impose on it. As we resist temptation, as we work for justice, and as we strive to live in accordance with God's will, we are participating in the creative work of God, aligning ourselves with His redemptive purposes for the world. And because Satan cannot create, he cannot stand against this divine work. No matter how hard he tries to distort or corrupt, he will never be able to unmake what God has created. This is the ultimate triumph of good over evil, not the defeat of a powerful adversary who has the ability to create something new, but the restoration of what was lost, the reclaiming of what has been corrupted. The victory does not belong to Satan, who can only distort and destroy, but to God, who is the creator of all that is good, and who will ultimately restore and renew all things to their intended glory. And in this victory we find our hope, because no matter how strong Satan's distortions may seem, they can never overcome the eternal power of God's goodness and creation.